The wind howled over the barren wasteland, carrying with it the smell of burned metal and dust. The ground was cracked and scorched, littered with broken weapons and silent machines. He walked alone, his boots pressing into the ash, scanning the horizon for movement. The war had ended here weeks ago, but the land still felt alive with danger. His name didn't matter to anyone out here. He was just another human survivor, wandering where others feared to go. A faint sound reached his ears, so soft that he almost thought it was the wind. It was not the groan of a dying machine or the echo of distant battle. It was something smaller, weaker, almost like a whimper. He followed the sound, moving between twisted beams and shattered stone. And then he saw her. She was tiny, barely reaching his chest even if she stood. Her armor was dented, too large for her frame, and a jagged blade lay beside her. One leg was twisted awkwardly, her breathing shallow. Her eyes were sharp, however bright. With defiance as they locked on him, she did not flinch when he stepped closer, but her small hands tightened around the broken weapon. "You're hurt," he said quietly. She didn't answer, her jaw clenched. The human crouched down, keeping his hands where she could see them. "I'm not here to harm you," he added. Her gaze didn't soften, but the weapon trembled in her grip. The ground shook suddenly, a low rumble in the distance. He glanced up to see the shadow of patrol ships sweeping across the wasteland sky. They were coming closer, and he knew they wouldn't care who was friend or foe. He had only seconds to decide. He stepped forward, slowly. She hissed a warning in her language, but her strength was fading. When he reached out, his gloved hand brushed against her cheek. To his surprise, she froze, not from fear, but as if the touch itself was strange to her. Then almost imperceptibly, she shivered. It wasn't the cold, it wasn't pain, it was the gentleness. No one had touched her like that in a long time, maybe ever. Her wide eyes held his, confused and unsteady. For a moment, the battlefield was silent between them. The ships were getting closer now, the rumble turning into a roar. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. "Come on," he said, his voice firm but low. She hesitated, her pride battling against her instinct to survive. But when his arms slid under her, lifting her with ease, she didn't fight. She was lighter than he expected, even through the armor. He could feel the fragile strength of her small frame. Her head rested against his shoulder, not in trust, but because she had no strength to hold it up. The patrol ships passed overhead, their searchlights sweeping dangerously close. He ducked behind a ridge of twisted metal, holding her close to his chest. Her breath was quick, but she stayed silent. They moved through the ruins, his steps careful and quick. Once, she stirred, trying to lift her head. "Why? Are you helping me?" she whispered, her voice raspy. He didn't answer right away, because in truth, he didn't know. Maybe it was because she looked so small in this endless, broken land. Maybe it was because her eyes, despite all the pain, still burned with a fun warrior's fire. Or maybe it was because in this wasteland, where everything was already lost, she felt like something worth saving. The cave entrance appeared ahead, hidden behind jagged stone. He slipped inside, the air cooler and still. Gently he set her down on a flat rock, removing his cloak to drape over her. Her fingers clutched the edge of it as if afraid he might take it back. He knelt beside her, checking the twisted leg. It was not broken, but badly strained. She winced when he touched it, but didn't pull away. Outside, the wind roared again, covering the sound of the ships fading into the distance. Inside, the small cave was silent except for their breathing. He looked at her again, even now, with the dirt and the blood. She carried herself like a fighter, but he had seen the moment when she shivered at his touch, and he wondered just how long it had been since anyone had treated her like she was something precious. He didn't say it aloud, but in his mind, he made a silent promise. He was not going to leave her here, not in this wasteland, not while she still had a spark of life. In her eyes, the cave was quiet, except for the faint sound of her breathing. The human sat nearby, leaning against the wall, watching her carefully. She had fallen asleep for a short while, her body too exhausted to keep fighting, but even in sleep, her small hands were clenched into fists as if she feared an attack. When she woke, her eyes darted around the cave before they landed on him. She tensed, pulling the cloak tighter around herself. "You didn't leave," she murmured, almost like it was a question. "I said I wouldn't." He replied simply, her brow furrowed, as if trying to understand his motives. He reached into his pack and took out a small container. Inside was the last of his food supply, a few pieces of dried ration, and a small water flask. He placed it near her. "Eat," he said. She didn't move at first, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "I don't take gifts from strangers," she said, her voice steady but weak. "It's not a gift," he answered. "It's survival." For a long moment, she studied him. Finally, she reached out and took the food, her fingers brushing his hand by accident. She froze again, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar warmth of another's skin. She ate slowly, almost cautiously, as though she was not used to being fed by someone else. While she ate, he checked the small devices on his wrist display. The patrol ships had moved further east, but they would return eventually. "We can't stay here long," he said. She looked up sharply. "Where would you take me?" "Somewhere safer than this," he replied. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Nowhere is safe for me." He could hear the weight behind her words. It wasn't just about the wasteland, it was about something deeper, something that made her believe danger followed her no matter where she went. He didn't press her for answers, but he could see it in her eyes. The way she avoided looking at him directly, the way she kept her shoulders squared as if bracing for betrayal. The hours passed slowly, the wind outside never stopping. He worked on fixing a small portable light, its soft glow pushing back the shadows in the cave. She sat quietly, sharpening her broken blade with a small stone. "You fight well for someone your size," he said after a while. Her gaze flickered to him, but she didn't smile. "I was trained to fight since I could walk," she replied. He nodded. "And yet here you are, letting me carry you." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't mistake that for trust." He didn't. But he also knew that if she truly wanted to leave, she would have crawled out of this cave already. Instead, she was still here, still listening, still watching him. When night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. He moved closer to the fire he had made. Pulling his cloak tighter, she shifted slightly, clearly cold despite the extra fabric around her. Without speaking, he slid a thermal blanket across the ground toward her. She hesitated before taking it, wrapping it around herself. Her eyes softened for just a second, then hardened again. It was in that small moment that he realized something. This was not a warrior who had never known fear. This was a warrior who had known nothing but it. Every choice she made, every glance she gave was shaped by survival, and survival had a price. For her, the price was trust. For him, the price was risk. As the firelight flickered between them, she finally spoke again. "Why are you really helping me?" She asked quietly. He considered lying, but instead, he told the truth. "Because no one else would." She stared at him for a long time, as if weighing his words against every betrayal she had ever known. Finally she said, "If you take me with you, you'll be hunted too." "I've been hunted before," he said without hesitation. She didn't answer, but something in her posture changed. She leaned back against the cave wall, her grip on the blanket loosening. The fire crackled softly, the sound filling the silence between them. Somewhere in that silence, a thin thread of something fragile began to form. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. Later that night, while she slept again, he stayed awake, listening to the distant hum of machines in the sky. He knew they would have to move at first light, but he also knew that leaving her here was no longer an option. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, they were now bound by the choice he had made in the wasteland, a choice that might cost them both more than they could imagine. The human realized she had been fighting long before they met, and probably longer than he'd been alive in this part of space. When they reached a narrow street between collapsed buildings, he stopped her. "You need food," he said, pulling out a ration pack. She shook her head. "We share later." He didn't push her. But her refusal was another piece of the puzzle forming in his mind. This was not just a fighter. This was someone who had learned to give before taking, even when she was starving. They climbed over debris, moving toward the shelter of an old transport station. Inside, dust covered everything, and old banners hung in shreds from the ceiling. She walked to a corner, kneeling down as if drawn there by memory. Her hand touched a faded mark on the wall, a series of sharp lines scratched deep into the stone. "What is it?" he asked. "Names," she whispered. "The names of my unit." The human stepped closer, reading the strange alien script. There were many names, but one was circled with a mark of honor. "That was your leader?" He guessed. Her eyes darkened. "My sister." The air between them grew heavy. She didn't say how her sister had died, but the battered armor on her small frame gave him the answer. When they set off again, the sun was higher, casting long shadows through the ruins. She walked a little slower now, her limp more noticeable. He offered his arm, but she shook her head. "I can walk," she said. Though her voice was tight with pain, he didn't argue, but he stayed close, ready to catch her if she stumbled. As they moved, he noticed her glancing at him more often, not with suspicion now, but with something like curiosity. Finally she spoke. "Your people, you fight for each other?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. She looked away. "Mine fight for rank." There was no bitterness in her voice, only fact. But it made him understand why his earlier touch had shaken her. She wasn't used to being seen as a person, only as a soldier. By midday, they reached the edge of the ruins, where open wasteland stretched for miles. He checked his wrist display and frowned. Patrol movement was picking up again. They would have to move quickly, but before they stepped out, she turned to him. "Why did you not take my weapon?" she asked suddenly. He blinked at her. "Why would I?" Her lips pressed together. "Because it would make me weaker." He shook his head. "I don't want you weaker." For the first time, a faint, uncertain smile touched her lips. Gone. Almost as quickly as it came, they crossed the wasteland under a relentless sun. The ground shimmered with heat, and the only sounds were their footsteps and the distant hum of machines. When the shadow of a patrol drone swept over them, he grabbed her hand and pulled her down behind a ridge. They waited in silence, the heat pressing down on them. Her hand remained in his even after the shadow passed. When she realized it, she pulled it back quickly. But her ears flushed a faint shade of color. By the time they reached the shelter of another rocky outcrop, her breathing was heavy. He helped her sit down, passing her water. She accepted this time without hesitation, drinking slowly. He watched her, thinking again about the armor, the names on the wall, and the way she had trembled at his touch. She was not just a warrior, she was a story no one had taken the time to hear. And now, whether she liked it or not, he was part of it. Asterisk. The sun was dipping low, casting the wasteland in long shadows. The human and the tiny warrior kept close to the rocks, moving quickly. The open land behind them felt too exposed, and every gust of wind carried the faint hum of distant patrol engines. They had no plan except to keep going, to stay ahead of the machines hunting them. It began as a faint vibration in the ground. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But then the sound grew, a deep, mechanical growl rolling across the sand. He looked over his shoulder and saw them. 3 scout bikes moving fast, their riders armored in black plating, the insignia of the enemy stamped on their chests. They were closing the distance quickly, kicking up trails of dust. "Run," he said sharply. Grabbing her hand, she didn't argue, her small frame darting forward with surprising speed despite her limp. They cut into the ruins of an abandoned industrial zone, weaving between rusted towers and collapsed walls. The echo of engines grew louder, bouncing off the metal around them. Her breathing was quick, but her grip on his hand was firm. A beam of red light swept across the ground near them. "Left!" she shouted, pulling him through a narrow passage between two leaning structures. The space was so tight they had to turn sideways to fit. Metal scraped against his back as they pushed through, emerging into a courtyard choked with debris. The first scout bike roared in after them, its rider raising a weapon without hesitation. She reached for the broken blade strapped to her back. It wasn't much, but her movements were fast and precise. She leapt onto the side of a rusted beam, using it as leverage to swing down at the rider. Her strike hit the weapon arm, knocking it aside just as the human shoved the rider off the bike. The machine toppled into a pile of rubble, sparks flying. "Go," he urged, pulling her away before the others closed in. They darted into a half-collapsed factory, the air thick with dust and the smell of old fuel. Inside, beams of evening light cut through the broken ceiling. The sound of engines outside told them the other scouts were circling. She crouched low, her eyes scanning every shadow. "They'll split up to trap us," she whispered. "Then we don't stay in one place," he replied. They moved quickly, climbing over conveyor belts and squeezing through gaps in the walls. The distant hum became a roar again. One of the scouts had found their path. The rider burst through a broken door, weapon raised. This time the human reacted first, grabbing a length of pipe from the floor and swinging it hard. The weapon clattered to the ground, and the tiny warrior dove for it, kicking the rider's legs out from under him. Together, they left the second scout down and out of the fight. But there was no time to celebrate. Shouts in the enemy's language echoed from outside. The third rider had called for reinforcements. The human grabbed her arm. "We need to lose them now," she nodded, her face set with determination. They slipped out through a side passage and found themselves in a maze of storage containers stacked high. The narrow lanes between them were dark, perfect for hiding but easy to trap. She gestured to the top of the containers without speaking. He crouched, letting her step onto his shoulders. She climbed up with agility, then reached down to pull him after her. From their higher vantage point, they could see the enemy moving below. Searching, the sun was nearly gone now, painting the ruins in deep reds and shadows. She touched his arm lightly and pointed toward a collapsed bridge in the distance. "If we can cross there, we can reach the lower tunnels," she said. He nodded, and they began moving across the container tops, silent as shadows. Halfway across, the whine of engines rose again. A new squad of riders appeared from the far side, their lights sweeping dangerously close. One of them spotted movement and fired, the shot hitting a container near them. Metal shrieked and sparks rained down. They ran, leaping from one container to another. When she landed on the edge of a rusted roof, it gave way under her weight. The human caught her wrist just in time, pulling her back up. Her wide eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just that grip. They made it to the bridge, but the structure was barely holding together. Boards and metal beams groaned under their weight. Below, the drop was long and unforgiving. Behind them, the engines grew louder again. She glanced back, her small frame tensing. "They won't stop. Neither will we," he said. Pulling her forward, they reached the other side and ducked into a narrow opening leading into the tunnels. The air inside was damp and cold, the walls lined with old wiring and rust. They kept running until the sound of engines was only a faint echo behind them. Finally, they stopped, catching their breath in the darkness. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes still sharp. "You fight like one of us," she said quietly. He gave a faint smile. "And you fight like someone worth fighting for." She looked at him for a long moment, then turned away. But in the dim light, he caught it, the tiniest, almost invisible smile before it vanished again. The tunnels were dark and cold. The only sound was the slow drip of water echoing off the walls. The human led the way, his small handlight casting a pale glow that barely reached the ceiling. The tiny warrior followed close, her steps light but steady. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them filled with the memory of the chase they had just escaped. They stopped at a wide section of the tunnel where the floor was dry. He set down his pack and began checking the map on his wrist display. She lowered herself, to the ground, leaning against the damp wall. Her armor shifted with a metallic creak, and she winced slightly as the dented plates pressed against her shoulder. "You're hurt," he said quietly. "I've been hurt before," she replied. Her voice calm but distant. He knelt beside her, carefully loosening the straps of her armor. She didn't protest, but she watched him closely, as if expecting him to take advantage of the moment. Instead, he worked slowly, removing one damaged piece at a time, placing them neatly beside her. When the last chest plate came off, he saw the truth. Under the heavy armor, her frame was too thin for a soldier who should have been eating well. Scars ran across her side, some fresh, others faded from battles long past. Her clothing beneath was simple and worn, a sharp contrast to the warrior image her armor gave. "You've been fighting for a long time," he said. "Since I could hold a blade," she answered without hesitation. Her eyes didn't soften when she said it. It was not pride. It was simply the life she had known. He cleaned the cut on her shoulder with a small cloth. She stayed still, though her jaw tightened at the sting. "You could have left me in the wasteland," she said suddenly. "I could have," he replied. "But I didn't." "Why?" "Because no one should die alone in the dust," he said simply. Her gaze lingered on him, searching for a hidden motive. Finding none, she looked away, staring into the darkness of the tunnel. "My people? They do not help without reason," she said. "We earn every act of kindness with a debt." "And what do you think you owe me?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I will repay it." He shook his head. "It's not a debt." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Unused to such an answer, they sat in silence for a while, the sound of dripping water the only noise. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I had a unit once. A family, or something close to it," she began. "They were all stronger than me, faster than me, but I never let them protect me. I fought just as hard." Her hand rested on the dented armor beside her. "This belonged to my sister," she said. "She died holding a bridge so I could escape." The human didn't interrupt. "I took her armor, even though it doesn't fit me," she continued. "I wear it so she can still fight with me." Her voice wavered for the first time, but she didn't cry. Instead, she straightened her back, looking at him as if daring him to judge her. He didn't. "Then I fight with both of you now," he said, his tone steady. For a moment, her eyes softened just a fraction. "You speak like someone who's lost too," she said. "I have," he admitted. "And I know what it's like to keep going because you have to, not because you want to." The fire in her gaze dimmed into something quieter, something that wasn't just survival. A small shift happened between them in that dark tunnel. They were no longer just a human and an alien warrior running from danger. They were two fighters carrying the weight of people they had lost. When they finally moved again, the tunnel narrowed, forcing them to walk close together. She glanced at him once, then twice, as if testing herself. Finally she said, "If we get out of this alive, I will follow you until my debt is paid." "It's not a debt," he reminded her. "Then call it loyalty," she said firmly. He gave a small nod. "I can live with that." Later, when they stopped to rest again, he noticed she had placed her armor within arm's reach, but also closer to him than before. It was a small sign, but a clear one. For someone who had trusted no one for so long, she was letting him stand in her circle, in the darkness, with danger still hunting them. They shared quiet words and a small piece of food from his pack. They didn't need to say it aloud. They were no longer running alone. The tunnels twisted and narrowed until the air felt heavy. The human and the tiny warrior moved in silence, their footsteps echoing faintly off damp stone. They had been walking for hours, and both could feel the weight of exhaustion. But neither said a word. They knew they were not safe yet. The faint hum reached them first. It was distant, but growing louder. A mechanical sound that did not belong in this place. He stopped, holding up a hand. She froze instantly, her eyes scanning the dark ahead. Then the hum turned into a low roar, and the ground beneath them began to vibrate. "They found us," he said under his breath. "How?" she asked sharply. "They must have tracked our heat trail," he replied. Her hand went to her weapon instinctively, her small frame tensing for a fight. The light appeared at the far end of the tunnel, a harsh white beam cutting through the darkness. It was followed by the shapes of enemy soldiers, their armor glinting under the glow. There were more than a dozen, moving fast, behind them. Another light flared, more soldiers closing in from the rear. "They're trying to trap us," she said grimly. "Then we make a hole," he replied, his voice steady. They chose the narrower end of the tunnel, where the walls closed in tight. Here, the numbers of the enemy would mean less. The human found a position beside a jagged rock formation. The tiny warrior stood in the center of the tunnel, blade in hand, her eyes narrowed, her breathing slow and controlled. She looked smaller than ever in that moment, but the air around her seemed to sharpen. The first enemy soldier came into view. Raising his weapon, the human fired first, the shot cracking through the tunnel and sending the soldier falling back. Another stepped forward, only to meet the edge of her blade as she darted in low. Her movements were quick, precise, almost too fast for the eye to follow. They fought side by side. Every time he pushed an enemy back with a shot, she was there to finish the fight. Every time she was about to be overwhelmed, he was there to block the strike or drag her out of reach. Dust and sparks filled the air, the smell of burned metal and sweat thickened their lungs, but the enemy kept coming. The roar of boots on stone echoed in both directions. A shot grazed his arm, the pain sharp and hot. She saw it and moved to shield him, her small body stepping in front of his without hesitation. The sight of her there, refusing to let him take another hit, lit something fierce in his chest. "They won't stop until we're dead," she said between breaths. "Then we don't give them the chance," he replied. Another wave charged them. He swung his rifle like a club. Knocking one soldier back, she leapt onto another, driving her blade into a weak point in the armor. The two of them moved like one creature, human and alien, different in every way, but fighting with the same heart. The tunnel shook with the weight of the battle. Shouts and the clash of weapons rang out. The human's vision blurred for a moment, and he realized he was breathing too hard. But when he looked at her, blood on her face, eyes bright with determination, he felt strength return. Then came the break they needed. One of the enemy's explosives fell from a soldier's belt during the fight, rolling across the floor toward them. He grabbed it instantly, yanking out the pin. "Cover me," he shouted. Without hesitation, she leapt in front of him, deflecting incoming fire with swift strikes. He hurled the explosive toward the larger group at the far end of the tunnel. The blast tore through the stone, sending rubble crashing down, sealing the path behind them. The sudden silence after the explosion was deafening. Dust rained down from the ceiling, the air thick with grit. Only the soldiers in front of them remained now. The tiny warrior raised her blade one last time. "For my sister," she whispered. Before charging forward, the human followed her into the last clash. When the final soldier fell, the tunnel was still again. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath. She stood in the center, her blade lowered, her chest rising and falling quickly. Blood dripped from a cut on her cheek, but her eyes were steady. "You're still standing," he said with a faint smile. "So are you," she replied. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped closer, placing her small hand against his chest. "You fight like you've always been beside me," she said quietly. "Maybe I have," he answered, his voice just as low. The moment lingered between them. It wasn't victory. They were still deep in enemy territory, but it was survival. And in this war, survival together meant more than anything. The tunnel stretched on in darkness, the air heavy with the scent of smoke from the explosion. The human walked ahead, his steps slow, one hand pressed to the wound on his arm. Behind him, the tiny warrior followed silently, her blade still in her grip. The battle had ended, but the echoes of it seemed to cling to them. Every breath they took felt like it carried the weight of what they had survived. They finally reached a wide chamber where the ceiling had collapsed. In the past, sunlight filtered down through the broken stone, touching the floor in pale gold. It was the first warm light they had seen in days. The human sat on a rock beneath it, exhaling slowly. The tiny warrior stood for a moment, looking at the light as if she was unsure whether to step into it. "You can sit," he said quietly. She hesitated, then walked forward, the sunlight glinting off the scratches on her armor. When she sat beside him, she didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the light. For a long moment, neither spoke. The war outside this tunnel felt distant here, almost like it belonged to another world. Finally, she broke the silence. "You could leave now," she said softly. He turned his head to look at her. "Why would I do that?" "Because you've done enough," she replied. "You carried me, fed me, fought beside me. My survival is not your burden." "It's not a burden," he said simply. Her hands tightened slightly on her blade. "In my world, no one does this without a reason," she said, her voice steady but low. "Then maybe I'm not from your world," he replied. She glanced at him then, her eyes searching his face as if to see whether he truly meant it. A soft wind passed through the cracks above, stirring her hair. "I was ready to die in that wasteland," she admitted. "I know." He said, "You changed that," she continued, "and I don't know how to repay it." "You don't have to," he answered. "Just keep living." She fell silent again, but something in her gaze shifted. It was no longer the wary look she had given him when they met. Now there was something steadier, something almost fragile but warm. The sunlight faded slightly as a cloud passed overhead. She stood, turning to face him fully. "I will tell you my choice now," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Choice?" "My people say a warrior must choose where to stand after a battle," she explained. "They can stand alone. They can return to their own, or they can stand with the one they trust." He waited, letting her speak at her own pace. "I choose to stand with you," she said simply. He didn't answer right away. It wasn't because he doubted her. It was because the words carried more weight than any promise she could make. She stepped closer, her small hand reaching into a hidden pouch in her armor. From it, she pulled a small piece of metal, the insignia that had once belonged to her sister. It was scratched, worn, but still carried the mark of honor. She held it out to him. "This is not given lightly," she said. "If you take it, it means you are my battle brother, my shield, my family." He looked at the insignia, then at her. Slowly, he reached out and took it, closing his fingers around it. Her eyes softened in that moment. And for the first time since he had met her, she truly smiled. It was small, but it was real. They stood there for a moment in the light, the dust drifting in the air like falling stars. Finally he spoke. "Then I guess we walk together." "We fight together," she corrected. He nodded. "And we live together." When they left the chamber, the sunlight followed them down the tunnel until it disappeared behind. Outside, the wasteland stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt as empty as before. She walked beside him now, not behind. Her blade hung at her side, but her free hand brushed against his every so often. Not by accident, never by accident. As they moved on, the horizon ahead seemed brighter than the one they had left behind, and for the first time in a long time, both of them felt the same thing. They were no longer alone.